She thought the worst thing that could happen was losing her legs. She was wrong. The worst thing was discovering that the two people she loved most in the world had been praying for her death. Amaka Okafor's world shattered in 3 devastating blows within 7 days. First, a car accident that left her paralyzed from the waist down. Second, the news that her father's billion-naira empire had collapsed into bankruptcy. Third, walking into her hospital room was her husband, holding divorce papers in one hand and her best friend's hand in the other. But what they didn't know was that she had heard everything. Every cruel word, every heartless plan, every vicious hope that she would just die and make things easier for them. They thought they had destroyed her. They thought she was finished, crippled, broke, and completely alone. They were about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives. Never underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. This is the story of the ultimate betrayal, the perfect revenge, and the shocking moment when a broken woman walked back into their lives and shattered everything they had built on her pain. In this story, you will discover the devastating price of judging people by temporary circumstances, the brutal consequences of betrayal during someone's most vulnerable moments, and how dignity and strategic patience triumph over cruelty and greed. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe button and tell us which part of Nigeria you are watching from. Amaka Okafor had been the young woman everyone noticed when she entered any room at the University of Lagos. Not merely because her father controlled major technology and telecommunications companies across West Africa, though that certainly helped. Rather, because she carried herself with the kind of assurance that came from knowing precisely who she was and what she deserved. She could have selected anyone. The business school was filled with ambitious men from established wealthy families, young men whose futures were already guaranteed through family connections and old money, men who spoke the language of power and privilege fluently. Instead, she chose Tunde Adeleke. He came from absolutely nothing, a scholarship student working multiple jobs to afford accommodation, living in the cheapest lodging he could find in Yaba, surviving on bread and beans more nights than not. But he possessed intelligence, ambition, and when he looked at her, he didn't see a billionaire's daughter, or a trust fund, or a ladder to climb. Or so Amaka believed then. He saw her, or so she desperately wanted to think. Their wedding was intimate, small, exactly what Amaka wanted, despite her father's strong suggestions for something more elaborate, befitting the Okafor family name. "Are you absolutely certain about this choice?" her father asked the night before the ceremony, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes searching hers with the concern that came from loving someone too much to watch them make life-altering mistakes. "I have never been more certain of anything, Papa," Amaka had responded, meaning it with her entire being. 1 year into their marriage, her father died suddenly. The massive heart attack struck during an important board meeting, stealing him away while he was passionately defending the future of the empire he'd built from absolutely nothing. The business empire transferred to Amaka completely, all of it. Billions in assets, thousands of employees, decades of legacy, condensed into legal documents that bore her signature and her enormous responsibility. The funeral was massive, business moguls and politicians and international partners filling the cathedral beyond capacity, though Amaka barely remembered any details through the overwhelming fog of grief. Tunde stood beside her throughout, his hand on the small of her back, his presence steady and supportive in ways that made her grateful she'd chosen him. 1 month after her father's burial, Tunde confronted her in the study where she'd been reviewing critical financial reports. "We need to have a serious discussion," he said, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. Amaka looked up from the documents spread across the mahogany desk her father had imported from Italy. "About what?" "The company," Tunde said,
sitting down across from her, his posture unnaturally stiff. "You're completely overwhelmed, Amaka. Anyone with eyes can see it. You're attempting to run a billion-naira empire while grieving your father, and it's far too much for one person." "I'm managing fine," Amaka said carefully, sensing something dangerous beneath his words. "Barely." Tunde leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I've been thinking extensively about this, and the solution is obvious. Transfer operational control to me. Allow me to manage the day-to-day activities while you focus on healing. I can handle business operations while you recover." The request landed between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. "Tunde, this is my father's life's work." "Which is precisely why you need help protecting it," he interrupted sharply, his voice rising. "I'm your husband, Amaka. I should be leading this family. That's what a man does. He takes care of his wife, manages the household, makes the difficult decisions." Amaka felt something cold settle deep in her chest. "The company isn't a household, Tunde. It's a technology and telecommunications empire that employs thousands and affects millions. My father spent 30 years building this, and he entrusted it to me because he believed I could protect it." "He left it to you because you're his only child," Tunde said sharply, cutting, "but that doesn't mean you're qualified to run it. You're what, 26? You've never managed anything this substantial. I have an MBA, actual business experience from working in corporate environments for years." "I also have an MBA, Tunde," Amaka said quietly, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "Plus, business experience from various departments. My father trained me for this responsibility my entire life. I've attended board meetings since I was 16 years old. I understand this company in ways that cannot be taught in any business school." Tunde stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "So that's it? You don't trust your own husband enough to let him help?" "This isn't about trust," Amaka said, though she was beginning to wonder if perhaps it was. "This is about responsibility and legacy. My father built this empire from nothing, and I will protect it with my life. That's non-negotiable." The look Tunde gave her then was something she'd never witnessed before. Not love, not understanding, something darker, something that resembled pure hatred. "We'll see about that," Tunde said softly, then walked out of the study, leaving Amaka alone with documents that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She didn't realize it then, but looking back, she would recognize this as the precise moment everything began to unravel. Outside the study window, storm clouds were gathering over Lagos. Amaka returned to her papers, completely unaware that inside her own home, a different kind of storm was already brewing. 6 months passed, and the emotional distance between Amaka and Tunde grew wider with each passing week. He stopped asking about company matters, though his resentment hung in the air like thick smoke, suffocating and impossible to ignore. Chisom started visiting more frequently, Amaka's best friend since their first year at university, the girl who'd been her maid of honor, the woman she trusted with secrets she'd never shared with anyone else. "He seems deeply unhappy," Chisom said one afternoon when Amaka was packing for a critical business trip to South Africa. They sat in Amaka's bedroom, sunlight streaming through the windows, everything appearing normal on the surface, while tension simmered underneath. "We're experiencing a rough period," Amaka admitted, folding a business suit into her suitcase. "He wants control of the company, and I cannot give him that. It's created significant friction." Chisom's expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy, though later Amaka would wonder if she'd misread it completely. "That must be so difficult for him," Chisom said softly, "feeling like he's not needed, like he's not important." "Marriage isn't about one person controlling everything," Amaka replied, though doubt had begun creeping into her thoughts during sleepless nights. "Of course," Chisom agreed quickly. "I just mean, for a man like Tunde, it must be extremely difficult being married to someone so powerful and successful. Not that it's your fault," she added hastily. just that I can see how it might make him feel diminished." The word hung between them, diminished, as if Amaka's success somehow lessened Tunde rather than complimenting him. "I need to finish packing," Amaka said, suddenly wanting the conversation to end. After Chisom left, Amaka stared at her reflection in the mirror, wondering when her marriage had become something requiring constant careful navigation rather than bringing joy and partnership.
The South Africa trip lasted 4 days. 4 days of high-stakes negotiations with telecommunications companies, of presentations and contracts and decisions affecting thousands of employees. Amaka returned exhausted but exhilarated by the partnership she'd secured, an expansion her father had always dreamed about. She wanted desperately to tell Tunde about it, wanted to share this victory with the man she'd married. Instead, she came home to an empty house. A note on the kitchen counter said he'd gone out with friends, would return late. Don't wait up. Amaka went to bed alone, the triumph of her business success feeling hollow without anyone to share it with. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that while she'd been in South Africa, Chisom had visited Tunde, had found him sitting alone in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his expression dark and bitter. "You look absolutely miserable," Chisom had said, sitting beside him on the expensive leather couch, close enough that their knees touched. "She doesn't trust me," Tunde had replied, the alcohol loosening his tongue. "Her own husband, and she won't even consider letting me help manage the company. What does that say about our marriage?" Chisom's hand had found his arm, her touch gentle and understanding in ways Amaka's hadn't been lately. "It says she doesn't know what she has," Chisom had whispered, and then she'd leaned in. The kiss had been brief, tentative, testing boundaries that should never have been tested. Tunde had pulled back, shock and guilt warring across his features. "We cannot do this." "Why not?" Chisom had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She doesn't appreciate you, Tunde. She keeps you at a distance, makes you feel small and insignificant. I see you. I see how incredible you truly are." "She's your best friend," Tunde had said, though his conviction was already weakening. "And she's married to the man I've been in love with since our university days," Chisom had replied, the confession hanging in the air like both confession and accusation. The second kiss had lasted longer. By the third, Tunde had stopped protesting completely. Over the following weeks, their affair intensified, fueled by Tunde's resentment and Chisom's long-harbored feelings, and the dangerous combination of proximity and opportunity. They met whenever Amaka traveled for business, which happened frequently as she worked tirelessly to expand the empire her father had entrusted to her care. They convinced themselves it wasn't wrong because Amaka was too focused on work to notice her marriage disintegrating. They told themselves they deserved happiness, even if that happiness was built on deception and betrayal. And they began to strategize. "Divorce her," Chisom said one night, lying in Tunde's arms in the bed he shared with his wife. "You're entitled to half of everything under Nigerian law. Community property is clear about that." "Half of $1 billion naira empire," Tunde mused, the idea taking root in his mind like a seed in fertile soil. "Think about what we could accomplish with that kind of money," Chisom continued, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "We could start fresh somewhere new, Lagos or Abuja, build our own company, our own life, away from her shadow." Tunde was quiet for a long moment, calculations running through his mind. "She would fight it fiercely," he said finally. "She'd make it extremely difficult, drag it through courts for years. Her lawyers would destroy me completely. Then we wait. We wait for the perfect opportunity, something that gives us leverage, something that weakens her position." Neither of them knew the opportunity was approaching sooner than they could have anticipated.
3 weeks later, Amaka departed for a business trip to Abuja, meetings with potential investors, tours of facilities they were considering acquiring, critical decisions requiring her presence and expertise. The drive back to the airport should have been routine. Instead, a commercial truck driver fell asleep behind the wheel. The collision happened at terrifying speed. Amaka's vehicle spun multiple times before slamming into a concrete barrier, metal crumpling like paper, glass shattering into thousands of pieces that caught the afternoon sunlight. When the paramedics extracted her from the wreckage, she was conscious, though barely. "My legs," she whispered, her voice weak and threaded with agony. "I cannot feel my legs." The hospital in Abuja stabilized her, treating her for broken ribs, severe lacerations, and catastrophic trauma to her lower spine, though the full extent of her injuries wouldn't be clear for days. They transferred her back to Lagos to a private hospital where specialists could evaluate the damage and determine her prognosis. Tunde received the call while Chisom was still at his house. He stood in the living room, phone pressed to his ear, listening to a hospital administrator explain that his wife had been in a catastrophic accident, that she was being transferred back for treatment, that he should come to the hospital immediately. When he ended the call, Chisom was watching him from the doorway. "How severe is it?" she asked, and the question held more calculation than genuine concern. "Severe," Tunde replied. "Spinal injury. They don't know if she'll walk again." Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken understanding of what this could mean for their plans. "You should go to the hospital," Chisom said carefully. "It would appear suspicious if you didn't." Tunde nodded, already thinking about how to play this situation, how to appear concerned while positioning himself for whatever opportunity might emerge from his wife's tragedy. The private hospital room was eerily quiet when he arrived, filled with the steady beep of monitors and the soft hiss of medical equipment. Amaka lay in the bed, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and even, in a way that suggested medicated sleep. Tunde stood at the foot of her bed for a long moment, studying her pale face, her motionless body beneath the white hospital blankets. He felt absolutely nothing, no fear for her recovery, no guilt about the affair he'd been conducting with her best friend, no love for the woman he'd promised to cherish in sickness and in health, only cold calculation about what this meant for his future. He stepped outside into the hallway, pulling out his phone, needing to talk to Chisom, needing to process what was happening. The hallway was empty, visiting hours nearly over, only the distant sound of nurses at their station breaking the silence. The medication had worn off faster than the nurses expected, pulling her back to consciousness while pain radiated through her spine and her legs felt disconnected from her body. She'd about to call for the nurse when she heard Tunde's voice in the hallway.
At first, she thought he was talking to a doctor, discussing her condition with appropriate concern. Tunde pressed the phone to his ear, his voice low as Chisom answered. "I'm at the hospital now," he said. "She's sleeping." "How does she look?" Chisom asked. "Broken," Tunde replied, glancing back through the window at Amaka's motionless form. "The doctors haven't given me a complete report yet, but from what the paramedics indicated, the spinal damage is catastrophic." There was a pause on Chisom's end. "What are you thinking?" Tunde's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge of something dark and calculating. "Honestly," he lowered his voice even further, turning away from the window, "I wish she had died in the accident." The words hung in the air between them, vicious and cold. "Tunde." "No, I mean it," he continued, his tone matter-of-fact, as if discussing a business transaction rather than his wife's life. "If she had died, the entire empire would be mine automatically. No divorce proceedings, no fighting over assets, no splitting everything in half. Just mine, clean, simple, complete. But she didn't die, Chisum said quietly. No, Tunde agreed, frustration bleeding into his voice. Which means I'm stuck going through a divorce, fighting her expensive lawyers for months or possibly years just to get what should rightfully be half mine anyway. The stress, the public scrutiny, the media attention. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. Maybe, Chisum hesitated, maybe this changes things. If she's badly injured, if she cannot run the company anymore. Then what? Tunde interrupted. I still have to divorce her to get anything. I still have to go through the legal process. The only difference now is I look like the heartless bastard who abandoned his crippled wife instead of just a man leaving an unhappy marriage. Inside the hospital room, Amaka's eyes opened wide. Her mind began replaying every single word she'd heard. I wish she had died in the accident. Amaka's breath caught in her throat, her entire body going rigid despite the excruciating pain. The entire empire would be mine automatically. No divorce, no fighting over assets, no splitting everything in half. Each word was a knife, precise and deliberate, cutting through everything she'd believed about her marriage, about her husband, about the life they'd built together. I'm stuck going through a divorce, fighting her expensive lawyers for months or possibly years just to get what should rightfully be half mine anyway. The stress, the public scrutiny, the media attention. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. Tunde continued talking, his voice carrying clearly through the partially open door, discussing her potential death with the casual disappointment of someone who'd just missed a lucrative business opportunity. Amaka lay perfectly still, her eyes open but unseeing, her mind racing despite the medication fogging her thoughts. He'd been planning to divorce her, had been conducting an affair with Chisum, had wished for her death for financial convenience. The betrayal was so complete, so comprehensive, that for a moment she couldn't process it fully. Then slowly, beneath the shock and pain, something else began to build. Something cold, something calculating, something that would require patience and planning and absolute precision. Tunde ended his call and returned to the room, his expression shifting into manufactured concern as he approached her bed. Amaka kept her eyes closed, her breathing steady, giving no indication that she'd heard anything. "Amaka," Tunde said softly, placing his hand on her arm with false tenderness. "I'm here now. Everything's going to be fine." The touch made her skin crawl, though she didn't move, didn't react, didn't give him any sign that she was awake and aware and already planning her next move. After a few minutes, Tunde's phone buzzed, and he stepped back out into the hallway to take another call. Amaka opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling, her mind already working strategically. When the doctor finally entered the room an hour later to check on her, Amaka was ready. "Doctor," she said, her voice weak, though her thoughts were sharp and clear. "I need to know the complete truth about my legs. Will I be able to walk again?" The doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, sat down beside the bed. "It's too early to say definitively, but the swelling around your spine needs to reduce before we can assess the full extent of the damage. But I'm cautiously optimistic. With intensive physical therapy and time, there's a reasonable chance you'll regain most of your mobility." Amaka absorbed this information, relief and strategy warring in her chest. "When my husband returns, I need you to tell him something completely different." The doctor's expression shifted to confusion. "I don't understand." "Tell him I'll be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of my life," Amaka interrupted, her voice steady despite everything. "Tell him the damage is permanent and irreversible." "Mrs. Adeleke, I cannot lie to your husband about your medical condition." "I'm not asking you to lie," Amaka said, though they both understood that's exactly what she was requesting. "I'm asking you to give him the worst-case scenario while we wait for the swelling to reduce and the full picture to emerge. I need to know something about him, about how he'll react. Please." The doctor studied her for a long moment, and something in Amaka's expression must have conveyed the desperation and determination behind the request. "This is highly irregular," the doctor said finally. "I know," Amaka replied, "but please, I'm begging you." After a long pause, the doctor nodded slowly. "I'll present it as the most likely outcome based on preliminary scans. But, Mrs. Adeleke, whatever you're planning—" "Thank you," Amaka interrupted, unwilling to discuss her motivations or her emerging plan. When Tunde returned to the room, the doctor delivered the news with professional gravity. "Mr. Adeleke, I need to discuss your wife's prognosis with you." They stepped outside, and Amaka listened through the partially open door as the doctor explained in carefully chosen words that the spinal damage appeared severe, that Amaka would likely never walk again, that he should prepare for her life in a wheelchair. Tunde's response was telling in its brevity. "I see," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "No questions about treatment options, no inquiries about therapy or experimental procedures, no desperation to explore every possible avenue for her wife's recovery. Just cold acceptance of information that served his purposes perfectly." Amaka closed her eyes and began to plan her counterattack. Amaka made a conference call from her hospital bed the next morning with 5 people holding key positions in the company. Bola Adeyemi, the company lawyer; Kunle Oladipo, her account manager; Funmi Ajayi, the company's financial analyst; Segun Eze, the general manager; and Nkechi Okoro, her personal assistant. Her voice was steady despite the medication, making her thoughts feel like they were moving through thick water.
"I need you to make Okafor Industries look completely bankrupt," Amaka interrupted, her words precise and deliberate. "Every news outlet needs to report that the company has collapsed. Total liquidation, overwhelming debts, assets seized, the whole empire crumbling." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Ma," Bola said carefully, "do you understand what you're asking? The stock price alone would—" "None of it will be real," Amaka clarified. "I need you to work as a team to create the appearance of bankruptcy while protecting every actual asset in structures Tunde cannot touch. Trusts, offshore accounts, holding companies, whatever it takes. But to the outside world, to the media, to anyone investigating, Okafor Industries needs to look completely destroyed." Another pause, longer this time. "May we ask why, Ma?" Kunle ventured. "I need to know who my husband really is," Amaka said quietly. "And I already have my answer. Now I need to protect what my father built before Tunde tries to take it." There was quiet understanding for a moment. "When do you need this done, Ma?" "Immediately," Amaka replied. "And there's one more thing. Our joint account has 3 million naira in it. I want you to monitor it closely. Don't freeze it. Don't protect it. Just watch it. I need to see what he does." "You're testing him," Funmi said, understanding dawning in her voice. "I already know he'll fail," Amaka replied. "I just need documentation for what comes next." 5 days after the accident, Tunde hadn't visited again. Amaka lay in her hospital bed alone, except for the nurses who checked on her regularly, watching news coverage of her company's spectacular collapse play out across every business channel. The coverage was perfect.
devastating and comprehensive, with financial analysts discussing how Okafor Industries had overextended itself, how debts had mounted secretly, how the sudden death of its founder had exposed fundamental weaknesses that led to total collapse. None of it was true, though the financial documents her team had created were flawless, foolproof, convincing enough to deceive even sophisticated investors. On the 7th day, Bola called with news. "He emptied the joint account this morning," Bola said. "All 3 million naira, wire transfer to an account in his name alone." Amaka closed her eyes, the confirmation landing like a physical blow, even though she'd expected exactly this. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Amaka," Bola's voice was gentle. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Amaka replied. "You're helping me see clearly for the first time in 2 years." That afternoon, Tunde finally came to the hospital, but he didn't come alone. Chisom walked beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm, both of them wearing expressions that were carefully neutral, though their body language screamed intimacy and ownership. They entered Amaka's room together, and the sight of them, her husband and her best friend, standing united against her, crystallized everything she'd heard in Tunde's phone call, everything she'd suspected, everything she'd now confirmed. "Amaka," Tunde said, his voice flat and businesslike, "you need to talk." He pulled divorce papers from inside his jacket and dropped them onto her lap with casual cruelty. "You cannot walk anymore," he continued, each word chosen to wound. "The doctors were absolutely clear about that. And according to every news station in the country, your father's company just collapsed. Total bankruptcy, total liquidation, assets seized, the whole empire crumbling." He leaned forward slightly, and his next words came out with vicious precision. "I cannot spend the rest of my life tied to a crippled burden who brings nothing to this marriage. You're broken, Amaka. Physically, financially, completely broken." Chisom's hand tightened on Tunde's arm, her expression a perfect mask of sympathetic concern that didn't quite hide her satisfaction in her eyes. "This truly is for the best," Chisom added softly. "You need to focus on your recovery, and Tunde needs to move forward with someone who can actually be a partner to him." Before Tunde could hand over the pen, something inside Amaka broke. Not her spirit, that remained intact, burning with cold fury, but the fragile dam holding back her pain. Tears began to stream down her face, her body shaking with sobs she could no longer contain. She looked past Tunde, directly at Chisom, her voice breaking with raw anguish. "Chisom, why?" Amaka said, her voice barely above a whisper, choked with tears. "Why did you do this to me? We were sisters. I trusted you with everything, my secrets, my fears, my life. I loved you like family." Her tears fell harder, her hands clutching the hospital sheets. "When my father died, you held me when I cried. When I got married, you stood beside me as my maid of honor. You were supposed to be my person, Chisom. How could you take my husband? How could you betray me like this while I'm lying here broken and helpless?" Chisom's face remained eerily calm, almost bored as she watched Amaka's emotional breakdown. Then, slowly, a cold smile crept across her lips. She stepped closer to the bed, her hand still possessively wrapped around Tunde, and when she spoke, her voice was laced with venom and mockery. "Oh, Amaka," Chisom said, her tone dripping with cruel amusement. "You really still don't understand, do you? You were never my sister. You were my competition, and honestly, you made it so easy." Amaka's sobs caught in her throat, shock mixing with her grief. Chisom leaned in slightly, her eyes glittering with malice, and when she spoke, her voice was sharp and cutting. "You want to know why I did this? Because I could. Because watching you have everything, the rich father, the successful company, the perfect life, while I had to work for scraps, made me sick. You walked around campus like a queen, like the world owed you everything, and everyone just gave it to you." She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "And Tunde? Please, he never really loved you, Amaka. He loved your money, your status, your father's empire. I just helped him see that he deserves someone better, someone who isn't a useless, crippled burden." Tunde shifted uncomfortably beside her, but said nothing, his silence confirming every cruel word. "So dry your tears," Chisang continued, her voice sharp and cutting. "Save your pity party for someone who cares. You're sitting there crying about betrayal and sisterhood, but let me tell you the truth. I have been waiting for this moment for years, waiting for you to fall from your high horse. And now that you're down here in the dirt with the rest of us, paralyzed and broke, I finally get to take what should have been mine all along." She straightened up, smoothing down her expensive dress, likely bought with money from Tunde's theft. "Sign the papers, Amaka. Let Tunde go so he can build a real life with a real woman. You're yesterday's news, a tragic story, a cautionary tale, and frankly, I don't have time to watch you cry about it." The cruelty was breathtaking, designed to destroy whatever spirit Amaka had left. Amaka stared at Chisam through her tears, seeing clearly for the first time the monster that had been hiding behind the mask of friendship for years. The woman she'd called her best friend had never existed. It had all been an act, a long con, a patient predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment was now. Amaka's hand trembled, not from weakness, though they would interpret it that way, but from the effort of containing the volcanic rage building inside her. Every fiber of her being wanted to scream, to fight back, to expose what she knew. But she didn't. Instead, she let them think they'd broken her completely. With shaking hands and tears still streaming down her face, she picked up the pen and signed her name across the bottom of the divorce papers, ending a marriage that had died the moment Tunde wished for her death in a hospital corridor. "Good girl," Chisam said, patting Amaka's hand with false sympathy. "This is really for the best. You'll see." Tunde took the papers without looking at Amaka's face, checked the signature with the casual efficiency of someone completing a business transaction, then turned to leave. As they reached the door, Chisam paused and glanced back at Amaka, still crying, still looking utterly destroyed, and smiled with cruel satisfaction.
"I hope you find some peace, Amaka," Chisom said quietly, her words as fake as their entire friendship had been. "Try not to be too bitter. After all, it's not personal. It's just survival of the fittest, and clearly you weren't fit enough." Then they left together, Tunde's arm around Chisom's waist, their bodies pressed close as the door clicked shut behind them. Amaka stared at the ceiling and began her recovery with a focus and determination that surprised even her physical therapists. 1 month later, the divorce was official, processed quickly because Amaka didn't contest anything, didn't fight for assets or make demands, simply let Tunde walk away with his clean break and his 3 million naira and his new relationship built on betrayal. Tunde used the money to start a real estate company in Port Harcourt, somewhere he and Chisom could build their new life away from the wreckage of Amaka's supposed destruction.
The company grew modestly over the following year, though Tunde positioned himself as a successful entrepreneur who'd escaped a failing marriage and built something from nothing, conveniently omitting the $3 million in stolen funds that had financed his fresh start. 12 months after the divorce, while Tunde planned his wedding and Amaka worked quietly to regain full use of her legs through intensive therapy that few people knew about, an invitation arrived. Cream cardstock with gold embossing. Tunde Adeleke and Chisom Nwosu request your presence at their wedding. And tucked inside, in Chisom's distinctive handwriting, the real message. Amaka, we would be honored if you could join us. We know it's been a difficult year for you, but we wanted you to share in our happiness. The venue has complete wheelchair access. We insured it specifically for you. Please come and witness what real love looks like. Amaka read the note 5 times, each word a transparent attempt at humiliation disguised as kindness, a final insult designed to showcase their triumph over her destruction. She picked up her phone and called her personal assistant. Book the jet, arrange complete security detail, and prepare my car. I have a wedding to attend. On the wedding day, Amaka's private jet touched down at the Port Harcourt Airport. The aircraft's arrival was noted by ground crews who recognized the Okafor Industries tail number and whispered among themselves about how that company had supposedly collapsed a year ago. Inside the luxury venue, 300 guests filled the rows of white chairs, business associates, investors, and partners who'd helped Tunde build his modest empire over the past 12 months. Chisom stood in the bridal suite wearing a dress that cost more than most people's annual salary, adjusting her veil with hands that trembled slightly with excitement. "Do you actually think she'll come?" Chisom asked, Tunde checking his reflection in a full-length mirror. "Probably not," Tunde replied, straightening his agbada. "She's too proud to let people see her like that, broken, penniless, confined to a wheelchair. But if she does show up, everyone here will see exactly what I escaped from." He turned to Chisom, his expression satisfied. "They'll see the difference between a burden and a real partner, between someone who holds you back and someone who lifts you up." Chisom smiled, though something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced Amaka wouldn't find a way to disrupt their perfect day. "What if she makes a scene?" Chisom asked quietly. Tunde laughed, the sound cold and dismissive. "What's she going to do? She's crippled and penniless. We hold all the power now." The ceremony was moments from starting when the commotion began. Someone near the entrance made a sound, something between a gasp and a choke. Then another guest turned, their eyes widening in shock. The murmurs started, rippling through the assembled crowd like a stone dropped in still water. The live band faltered mid-song, one drummer missing a beat, then another, until the music died entirely as all the musicians turned to stare at the entrance. Tunde felt it before he saw it, the shift in the room's energy, the way every head turned toward the doors, the sudden silence that fell over 300 people like a heavy blanket. He turned, irritation flashing across his face, and froze completely. The doors stood open, and Amaka Okafor walked through them. Walked, not in a wheelchair, not using a cane, not struggling or limping or showing any sign of the permanent disability the doctors had diagnosed. Walking on legs that moved with perfect grace and confidence, wearing a shimmering gown that cost more than most people's annual salary, her hair styled in elegant waves that caught the light, surrounded by 6 men in dark suits who moved with the precision of professional security detail. She walked down the aisle Chisom was supposed to walk down in 10 minutes, and every single eye in the venue followed her. The whispers grew louder. "Is that Amaka Okafor? She's walking. How is she walking? I thought she was paralyzed. Wasn't her company destroyed? Why does she have security? That dress is designer. How can she afford that?" Tunde's face drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing without sound as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Beside him, Chisom swayed slightly, her expensive bouquet trembling in hands that had suddenly gone numb. Amaka reached the front of the venue and stopped, her eyes finding Tunde across the crowded space, her expression serene and composed and absolutely terrifying in its calm. The master of the ceremonies, a nervous young man who'd been hired to keep the ceremony running smoothly, approached Amaka with a microphone, his hands shaking visibly. "Miss Okafor, we weren't expecting. Would you like to say a few words?" Amaka's fingers closed around the microphone with practiced ease, the gesture natural and commanding in a way that suggested she'd spoken to crowds much larger than this one. She turned to face the assembled guests, her security detail positioned discreetly behind her, and smiled. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the venue. Tunde tried to speak, to object, to regain control of the situation, though his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Amaka." "You see," Elena continued, ignoring him completely, "I believe it's important to witness moments of truth, and today we're all going to witness several important truths." She paused, letting the silence build, watching as phones began to emerge from pockets and purses, as guests leaned forward in their seats. 13 months ago, I was in a terrible car accident, severe spinal trauma. The doctors initially thought I might never walk again. Her eyes found Tunde. "My husband, at the time, the groom standing before you, visited me in the hospital exactly once. During that visit, I overheard him on the phone outside my room telling his girlfriend that he wished I had died in the accident, because then, you see, he could inherit my father's empire without the stress of divorce proceedings." The gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Natasha's face went absolutely white. "That girlfriend," Amaka continued calmly, "was my best friend since university, the woman who is currently wearing a white dress and standing beside him." She turned to address the crowd more fully. "What my husband didn't know, what neither of them knew, is that I heard every single word, and in that moment I made several decisions." Amaka's smile never wavered. "First, I asked my doctors to tell him my condition was permanent and irreversible. I wanted to see what kind of man I'd married. Would he stay? Would he support me through recovery? Or would he abandon me?" She paused. "He abandoned me. He divorced me while I lay in a hospital bed, calling me a crippled burden in front of medical staff, taking every kobo from our joint account, 3 million naira, and leaving me with nothing."
Tunde finally found his voice. "That's not... The company was bankrupt. You had nothing." "Ah, yes," Amaka interrupted smoothly. "The bankruptcy. That was my second decision. You see, I instructed my team to create the appearance of total financial collapse. Every news outlet reported it. Every financial analyst believed it. And most importantly, you believed it." She gestured to her security detail. "But Okafor Industries never actually failed. Every asset was protected. Every employee kept their job. Every contract honored. The bankruptcy was theater, performed specifically for an audience of 2 people who were planning to steal half of my father's legacy." The crowd was completely silent now, every eye fixed on Amaka. "The 3 million naira Tunde took from our joint account," Amaka continued, "that was a test.
money I left deliberately accessible to see if he would steal from someone he believed was crippled and penniless. He took every single kobo within hours of the bankruptcy news breaking. She turned back to Tunde, whose face had gone from white to a sickly gray. That money financed the company you've spent the last year building, didn't it, Tunde? The company you've told everyone you started from nothing. The company that's currently negotiating contracts with several of the people in this room. Tunde's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Amaka addressed the crowd again. I'm here today not for revenge, though I won't pretend this doesn't feel satisfying. I'm here to deliver a message about character, about loyalty, about what happens when you abandon people during their darkest moments and build your success on cruelty and theft. She paused, letting her words sink in. Never trust a man who abandons his wife in a hospital bed. Never trust a woman who steals her best friend's husband while that friend fights for recovery. And never, ever build a business relationship with people whose foundation is betrayal. Because if they'll do it to someone they vowed to love, they'll certainly do it to you. Phones were out throughout the crowd, some recording, others already typing furiously. Amaka could see Tunde's investors and partners exchanging glances, see the calculations happening behind their eyes, see the exact moment several of them decided to cut their losses. One man in the third row stood up. Tunde, we need to discuss our contract immediately. Another rose. The loan we discussed, I'm going to have to reconsider. Then another and another. The venue erupted in whispered conversations, in hurried phone calls, in the sound of business relationships dissolving in real time. Chisom reached for Tunde's arm, her face streaked with tears that had ruined her carefully applied makeup. Tunde, do something! But there was nothing to do. Amaka handed the microphone back to the MC, who took it with trembling hands and turned to leave. Her security detail fell into formation around her, and she walked back down the aisle she'd entered through, her head high, her steps confident, leaving chaos and destruction in her wake. Behind her, she heard Chisom's voice rising in panic, heard Tunde trying desperately to explain, to salvage something from the wreckage, to convince people that Amaka was lying or exaggerating or manipulating the truth. But the damage was done. By the time Amaka reached her car, phones throughout the venue were broadcasting what had happened. Social media was exploding with the story, and the empire Tunde had built on stolen money and betrayal was crumbling faster than he could possibly contain. Amaka settled into the back seat of her car, her driver pulling away from the venue as police cars approached. Someone had apparently reported the use of stolen funds, likely one of Tunde's now former investors looking to protect themselves from association with fraud. Amaka pulled out her phone and called Bola. "It's done," she said simply. "I'm watching it unfold on social media," Bola replied. "Every business news outlet is covering it. Tunde Adeleke's company is finished. Several partners have already announced they're pulling out, and there are calls for investigation into the source of his startup funding." "Good," Amaka said quietly. "How do you feel?" Bola asked. Amaka considered the question as her car merged onto the highway, carrying her away from the wedding that had transformed into a reckoning, away from the people who'd betrayed her, towards a future that was entirely her own. "Free," she said finally. "I feel free." The wedding venue behind her descended into chaos, guests leaving in confusion, vendors demanding payment that Tunde could no longer guarantee, investors making urgent phone calls to distance themselves from a man whose character had been exposed in the most public way possible. And in the bridal suite, Chisom stood alone, her wedding dress perfect and pristine, while outside, Tunde argued desperately with lawyers on his phone, trying to salvage something from the empire that had just collapsed around him. The burden they'd discarded had walked back into their lives, and in doing so had destroyed everything they'd built on her pain.
Dear viewers, in the shadows of betrayal, strength is born. In the valley of abandonment, wisdom rises. This story reveals a truth as ancient as time itself, that cruelty planted in darkness will harvest its own destruction in the light. You have witnessed how patience becomes power, how silence transforms into thunder, and how the underestimated rise to reclaim their throne. When the world calls you broken, remember, diamonds are forged under immense pressure. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Chisom's cruel words to Amaka in the hospital were worse than Tunde's betrayal? Who was the bigger villain in this story, the cheating husband or the backstabbing best friend? Comment Chisom or Tunde and tell us why. Also, do you think Amaka should have seen the signs of Chisom's jealousy earlier? Drop yes or no and tell us what red flags you spotted that Amaka might have missed. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more jaw-dropping, emotional, and life-changing stories that teach powerful lessons about resilience, betrayal, justice, and the incredible strength of the human spirit. Your story could be next. Share your own experiences in the comments below.